What's up, Legends? Welcome back to another week of Legends. I'm your host, Chobra. We're back with another online episode, and we have LS joining us once again to talk about the LCK. Going off of the playoff matches that happened last week, we now have one match left to decide who the best team is here at the LCK Summer Split. Damwon Gaming versus DRX, and while Damwon did look dominant so far, DRX did get a nice win against Gen.G, so this should be a fun match, LS.
Yeah, you know what was also a really fun match? T1 versus Africa. You want to talk about that, or?
You know, fun is a subjective word.
Okay.
Fun's a subjective word, but I guess it did happen. So we can talk about it. Yeah, I mean, playoff matches, I guess, all are pretty important. LS, I mean, is there something in particular you'd like to bring up?
No, I just thought it was strange. You just skipped right over it.
Yeah, you know, we're kind of short on time. We want to make sure we can dive into everything. But since you brought it up, T1
that was
versus...
timeout versus afraid. That was there. What do you think those letters stood
yes,
for?
the classic matchup. T1 versus Africa Freaks. I mean, we saw it on broadcast too, right? All the commentators, all the casters. I mean, I think a lot of the fans too, unless you were just straight up rooting for Africa Freaks.
Yeah.
Everyone thought T1 was going to win, and quite possibly just 2-0. It did not happen that way. In fact, Africa Freaks won that first game.
Yeah, I mean, Africa, they came out into the series. They ended up surprising it really big. Game number 1, T1 just blundered. They did I call it the TSM Classic, when you heavily prioritize 500 gold on a turret. And they're team fighting in front of the turret, Mountain Soul's coming up. And just a short bit, they end up expending a couple of summoner spells. They don't really get anything, and even if they did, it wouldn't change the dynamic of the game. And then they get rolled in the following Dragon Dance.
Oh, no. Steps back forward, now has to flash out. Zenith Blade going to connect. There's the ultimate out of Keen. He wants to try and get closer. They do manage to find him as bullet time gets so much value.
And then from there, you have an Olaf on your team, and things are starting to feel a little bit bad. They just slowly lost control of the game. Game number 2, Faker comes in. They have a very, very good game. From pretty much start to finish, they were totally in control of everything.
Some Graviton procs. Okay, Cuz in position. There's an immediate Destiny down towards the bottom side as Cuz jumps on top of the Aphelios. Ben's going to die as well.
And then game 3.
Yeah. Well, you know, let's kind of rest on that game too for a little bit first, right? Because like you said, you know, Faker comes back in. You know, there's been a lot of kind of questions on people's mind, like, you know, Faker hasn't been winning as dominantly. You know, what's going on? And he comes in and says, "No, I'm still here." Right? They win in that T1 fashion. I think everyone wanted to see. And another interesting point in that game too was the Aurelion Sol pick coming out for Fly on Africa Freaks. And first question for me is, can this work at all? Like, whether it's Fly or anybody else?
So Aurelion Sol is a champion that since this mini rework, a lot of pros have complained about. But there is a player in EU West. I don't know what his official alias is. I think that most people just call him Diablo. He's a very famous Aurelion Sol player. Mid-top, I think even marksman, he plays Aurelion Sol. And he just dominates. He destroys the ladder, consistently gets extremely high. And he thinks that it's good. And I know that pro players think that when this guy's playing it, the champion's really bonkers. And competitive, he's a little bit harder to pull off because everyone's aware, okay, there's an Aurelion Sol in the game. These are his patterns. This is his tendencies. This is how he's going to conduct himself. And it's a little bit easier to play around. The really weird thing for Fly, though, is that he picked it into Twisted Fate. So
which normally isn't something you want to be doing.
Yeah.
And you did mention it during the broadcast. You guys mentioned that obviously for Fly, Aurelion Sol is a kind of a pocket pick, right? It's a champion that Fly's very comfortable with. Should we, you know, from a viewer's perspective, should we just be chalking it up to, okay, Africa Freaks was in the lead, you know, Faker comes in, they're trying to kind of shift things up?
I feel like the Aurelion Sol was maybe just Fly thinking that if he got a edge, it would be the most comfortable for him to carry on and influence the game. I liken it to something like Ixu picking Alawi blind, even though he knows that he could get countered or that he could have a rough time. Because if he does manage to get ahead, he's on a champion that he probably feels like it's just second nature.
Well, I guess a question that still remains on my mind is, even if you're a player like Fly who, you know, you're this confident on a champion like Aurelion Sol, picking it into TF, I mean, if you get ahead, can you still do a lot, or the counter matchup, doesn't it still kind of trump what you're able to bring?
Yeah, Twisted Fate's still going to be able to contend. He'll hit a break point where he can still do things, but if you're ahead of him and you have extra HP to spare, you're up in levels, Destiny Gate is a pretty big cooldown, whereas you're going to still have a lot more freedom, and if you're constantly providing coverage over mid lane and surrounding it for your jungler, Aurelion Sol can still do a lot, and then he can transition into the mid and late game.
Okay, so there was some potential, like you said. It's perhaps something more related to his comfort on that champion. But all in all, T1 wins in T1 fashion in that game too. And I mean, things looked good going into game 3. Let's start with the draft. Were there any kind of warning signs that it might not go as people predicted in game 3?
So I feel like in game 3, I remember casting it live, and obviously we're remote. Now, normally on the desk at LOL Park, either Atlas or Valdez, they'll have their tablet open, and they'll use that to look up information in real time, or they'll have Twitch chat open so that we can gauge, how things are going. And then for me, normally I have my phone if there's something I really, really want to look up. Now, because I'm at home and I have all the monitors that I do and whatnot, I remember casting the game live, and in the highlights when it's passed over and the notifications that are popping up on my screen or whatever, there were pro players. I see this after the match. There were so many pro players from LEC and from LCS and from elsewhere, former Korean players and whatnot, that would message me, and they were like, "What is Cuz doing? What is his opening path?" And I went into this talk pretty extensively on one of my co-streams, where basically Karthus, if you want to take a super conservative route, you can still be there to block the dive attempt that you might be anticipating against your top laner. But also there's the argument where Karthus can also just full clear and then let your top laner die and then give Karthus all the farm. Because then what ends up happening is Karthus will get a 2.5 level lead over the enemy, and Renekton is not a core piece to the victory. It's all about Karthus in that game. So he can salvage it later on with Requiem, but Cuz took one of the worst, actually probably the worst, opening Karthus clear that you could take. And then Faker got slept on set. He didn't flash. He tried to ghost. He got killed. And then from that point, jungler permanently behind, top laner permanently behind. Jungler has like no power because he's so slow inside of the jungle. He's not getting levels. He's not getting EXP. And then he gets killed by the True Shot Barrage. Everything was just going wrong for T1. And it all started with Cuz's path.
Like, this is weird because it's not like Cuz isn't familiar with Karthus, right? Like, we've seen him, if anything, kind of Cuz showing up again during the summer split was when he started playing Karthus again. When Karthus came back into the meta, he seemed to be very comfortable once again back on these AP junglers. And I know I still remember when the game started, you guys brought attention to that. You said, okay, well, now it's all about Karthus's path. Let's see how fast he clears. And then it just didn't happen. It wasn't even that he was a few seconds late. It just didn't happen. And of course, go ahead.
No, I mean, I'm sure that there's people that can try to do mental gymnastics to justify that it's Cuz, and so clearly there's some just higher level understanding that we're not getting.
Sure.
But the thing is that you can go and simulate every variation, and you can see that Volibear doesn't actually have real punishes that you're claiming exists. There's nothing that Karthus really has to respect playing around, because if he's playing right, he's the one with autonomy.
Yeah, and when we talk about this, like you said, obviously, Cuz, I'm sure, had a thought process, but we're talking from a bird's eye point of view, right? What's the ideal thing? And from that, when we're able to think about everything from a third perspective, it really didn't make sense, regardless of what the thought process was in game. And, you mentioned kind of the cherry on top was that the True Shot Barrage, right? It wasn't even aimed for Cuz. I mean...
True Shot Barrage. Oh, my God, just snipes him! Oh! Where did they have that vision? How did they know?
At that point, all hope seemed lost for T1. That kill in the jungle, it just seemed like, even on the other side for Freak of Freaks, you guys were talking about the calls they were making on the comms. They were like, wait, what? Like, why did he die there? What was he doing there? And things just didn't pan out. I mean, Other than that, did you just see anything from either team, whether it's a Freak of Freaks kind of showing any strengths in that game 3, or T1 perhaps kind of showing these other cracks that were not characteristic of T1 in that game 3?
No, I don't even think it's really. This isn't a game that you look at as T1 and you get worried about. The game was over at 7-8 minutes. Faker's so far behind in mid lane. He looks like he's tilted. I don't, just from the way that he's moving as champion, he was making some blunders after the fact. And I mean, if you're a laner on T1 and that was your Karthus that game, and you just want to FF and report, just 9x is what's going on.
Yeah. Well, I think you hit the nail on the head, though, right? Is that if you're looking at it as a team, this isn't, you're not looking at it and getting concerned. It was something happened in the beginning, right? Obviously, we can't get into all the players' heads, especially back in time, and things were lost, right? It started snowballing so hard downhill that, you don't spend too much time on looking at the rest. T1 still has a chance to go to Worlds through the regional qualifier. So if you're a T1 fan, you can hope that, just kind of these weird instances don't happen, that they show up in the form that we know them as, and that they're able to go through that bracket. But for now, in the playoffs, let's take a Freak of Freaks up the bracket. They go up against Gen.G, and they did not stand a single chance. I mean, even the little sparks we saw during the T1 match didn't show up, and they just lost 3-0.
Yeah, they just get pulverized. And I mean, this is basically akin to some of the stuff that's happened to them in regular split whenever they face some of the top 4 teams. And it felt like it was just on steroids in that series because Gen.G looked so dominant. And then Gen.G showed similar fashion in 2 of the games against DRX in the following series that ended up happening. But Afrika, as I already said, I don't think that they should have been able to win Game 3. I think Game 3 versus T1 was set up to be pretty good, but they managed to get the upset.
And then they move on, and they're just outmatched, outclassed, right, by Gen.G. But let's talk about Gen.G a little bit then before we talk about the Gen.G DRX match. Just as a whole, we mentioned last week with you and Wadid that Gen.G is a solid team, right? Solid as a rock. They're consistent. And then during the playoffs, the games they won, both against Afrika and, like you mentioned, against DRX, they seem to just be on fire. Like some kind of energy that we haven't seen during the summer split, even, where they're being a bit more proactive, more aggression. And if they were to continue to play like that, right, whether they automatically get seeded to Worlds through the points or through the regional qualifier, do you think this is another team that LCK fans can latch onto next to Damwon to kind of have hope for LCK showing up again?
I think Gen.G can be really good depending on who they get matched against if Gen.G would end up going to Worlds. I think that they could have some good matchups because of the fact that they can be a rock. They can be very, very sturdy, and playstyles like that, or identities like that, I should say, can be pretty good at Worlds, especially in what is going to be a very chaotic Worlds meta, where no one's boot camping, no one's really scrimming, everything is just going to take place literally within that 1 month span.
Well, then we saw what Gen.G is capable of, right? And we saw what T1 should be capable of. Let's fast forward. In a scenario where they meet in the regional qualifiers, Gen.G versus T1, who would you favor? Obviously, kind of excluding any crazy exceptions.
Joe.
Okay. All right. You favor Joe. That is the correct answer. You're a smart man.
Thanks.
Okay. All right. So Joe's going to Worlds. Joe's going to make the Worlds for LCK. I like it.
I live for the tweets at Arnold.
They are pretty good. We've got some bangers up there. All right. Well, let's bring it back then, and let's move forward in the playoffs. Obviously, we're currently ramping up towards the finals, which is coming up. Yeah. But before that, Gen.G moves on, and like you said, shows fire against DRX, but doesn't win the match. And that was a bit of an ending.
So I agree with you that their 2 wins over DRX were so dominating, and I've been pretty outspoken that I think that if the pause didn't happen, the momentum riding high for Gen.G, the emotions going probably very well, they're probably feeling very on point, and DRX probably being very under pressure and maybe tilted. Without that time to alleviate maybe some of those emotions, I think Gen.G actually probably takes the series, all things considered. When I was watching that series, and also even if you consider how it ends with the Baron and then just DRX managing to blitz the Nexus against the Ocean Soul, and it reminded me of TES versus JDG in the sense, or one of the more recent series, obviously, in North America as well, but mostly TES versus JDG in the sense where it felt like actually this time around, rather than TES winning, JDG would have won, and I felt like TS just looked so much better than JDG. And in this series, between DRX versus Gen.G, I thought DRX just looked so much better at so many different points of the game. It really felt like, to me, DRX had no business winning the series. Even it was one of those things where I feel like, as a color commentator, you don't feel good watching it. Because it feels like it was a big upset.
Right, because obviously you're looking at it at a point from, like, what's the ideal play, who normally performs better. You're looking at the analysis of it, and this seemed to be an exception, really, from all those points. And, I mean, of course, DRX made that tweet as well with their mascot Dio kind of trumping everyone with his predictions that retroactively that DRX won 3-2. But I want to bring us back to that Baron call that you mentioned, right? I mean, even in that Game 5, DRX had the lead, but then Gen.G got the Dragon Steel. Things were looking great for them. Ocean Soul. I mean, what went wrong in that? I mean, was the call wrong to begin with? I guess let's start there. The Baron call itself, was that wrong in your opinion?
I think that they could have played it a lot safer, for sure. They don't need to necessarily just start the Baron, because if you're asking yourself from DRX's perspective, what is the only way they can win? It's going to be in a fight like that. I think Deft got off an insane ultimate in the fight. Ruler, obviously, he had options to stay alive and do different things a little bit differently, but he didn't. He opted into just trying to be a little bit greedy at the end. It ended up coming back to bite him. I feel like the call is definitely off, because they don't, at that point in the game, they don't really need Baron to win, or at least they don't need to blitz it in that fashion. They should have been much more willing to take a more controlled environment fight.
And for those who, maybe didn't watch it fully or didn't get to follow up on it, I mean, Gen.G also got the Baron, I believe, right? They ended up finishing it. So that itself wasn't the issue. But like you said, because they were so focused on that, the fight afterwards was definitely a bit messy. For DRX, I mean, let's then take it back in DRX's shoes. The Dragon Steel before that from Gen.G. If Gen.G didn't get that Dragon, like, was DRX looking good in the beginning of that game, or would you say it was so tight that you couldn't really call it until that very end?
I think that Chovy was looking really fantastic. I mean, Chovy looked fantastic throughout the entire series. He was the only player that was basically able to do anything, and we saw that the games where he wasn't able to do things due to the dynamics that were surrounding him in terms of, like, champion picks and what was happening inside of the laning phases, DRX just really fall apart. He is the pillar of the team right now, especially with the way that the meta is in regards to the marksman, because Deft is going to have less agency inside of the games.
We'll talk about this in a little bit more detail when we talk about the finals, but would you say DRX right now, the only way they for sure win is if Chovy is able to, like, pretty much 1v9 in any matchup?
I think the only way they win is Damwon forfeit. I think that's pretty much it, Chobra. If they forfeit,
okay. All right. We'll get to that analysis. All right, we'll get to that analysis when we get to the finals itself. I'll keep that in mind, though. Okay. Another thing I think for DRX, and I've talked about this with some people before, the question of Lilia, right, as a champion right now, fitting into the pro meta. DRX still seems pretty adamant about picking up Lilia. Pioche seems to be playing it quite frequently, and seems to be fairly satisfied with it. From kind of a bird's eye view, do you think Lilia does her job well, or is the call still out?
I think she's a very good champion that is a hybrid between utility and AP carry. I think that she's able to do both, and there's not many champions that exist like that right now. I mean, Gragas obviously historically is one, but Lilia offers it in a bit of a different way because of her speed, and I think that adds a new twist to the jungle, because Jungle has been missing a champion like this from the AP category, and now Lilia offers that. So she can have a very shaky early game, but as long as she gets through the initial early game, her pacing becomes really, really scary, and her kit scales very, very, very well because she just has so much power with 2 and 3 items that she ends up purchasing. It makes it very obnoxious for the opponents to fight, and then in mid to late game standoffs, her E and her R are just broken abilities.
Yeah, of course, being able to kind of span no matter what distance as long as it doesn't hit a target, and then putting someone to sleep, right, just taking them entirely out of a fight or even a standoff is a massive difference. So I personally, I think it's cool, right, that we're seeing a lot of choice from DRX, like picking up this new champion, trying to make her work as much as possible, and they're definitely succeeding in that realm. So we'll see if they continue that in the finals and maybe even onward as well. Before we move on, we talked about it briefly in the beginning of this discussion for the semifinals, but we talked about how there was the long pause. Of course, they even decided, both teams agreed, right, to change the client just so they could continue the match.
Yes.
And, you know, from what your experience is so far, whether it's, you know, coaching players or just analyzing kind of teams and their performances, what do you do, like, as a team when that happens? Obviously, like you said, the momentum stops, right? You can't change that. The reality is everything stops. Emotions are going to calm down on both sides. But especially for the team that, you know, is kind of in the lead of a series, you know, how do you prepare yourself mentally in a situation like that?
I don't know what the best solution is. I have no idea how. I mean, everyone's going to react to it differently. What I want to do for this answer is I want to basically just say what I would be thinking. If I'm Gen.G and the pause had gone on that long, I think I would actually try to get the match to go and play another day. Because I feel like the added mental burden or stress from feeling like, okay, there's going to be another match in a day or two, we're going into it, down 2 games, this is do or die. Let that pressure build back up rather than the opponents try to get a mental reset during those 3 hours, but they're still like in the game mode where they're still in that competitive mindset and they're still feeling fresh inside of the series. I feel like that would be something that, like, I personally would like to do. Obviously, everyone's going to react to it different.
Yeah, watching it, I mean, personally, I felt the same way. I was kind of surprised, given just how long it went, that both teams agreed to go that late into the night. But also, I know other people as well, like you mentioned, that they react differently, right? They're like, no, you know, the adrenaline's still going. Like, I want to just run it to the end right now. So obviously, the choice was involving all the parties there. You know, not to harp on this part too much, but what's your take on the fact that it was played on, you know, the live client, right? I mean, there were definitely some differences there between, like, within one match, and this has never happened before.
Yeah, it's never happened, which is really interesting. So obviously, there's going to be a lot of controversy over this series for probably years to come. This will be one that people look back to as, well, this is definitely very strange. I think 10-17 doesn't really have that big of changes, so I don't think that it affects all that much. From a competitive standpoint, it's not super broken that, I mean, some patches have outright killed champions in the past.
Yes.
So that would be a very big meta shakeup. I think, fortunately, because of the way that Riot's been doing the balance patches recently, the fact that Yone is still disabled, I feel like it was still a pretty reasonable thing to do, to just go and play on live. I don't know why it took so long to just go on to live. I think that one was a little bit strange, given the amount of time that was going by, but I think it was fine.
Yeah, like you mentioned, pretty much fortunate, right, that we had these patches where it wasn't too crazy, and I can only assume that both teams agreed to it because of that, right? Yes. It wasn't some crazy, you know, patch change. So at the end of the day, like you mentioned, I mean, Gen.G, they were looking strong, but DRX gets the win, right? They edge it out 3-2, and now we have the finals of the LCK Summer 2020 split coming up. DRX versus Damwon. You made your prediction very, very clear that you think there's really no way that DRX is going to win. Well, let's let's talk about some matchups here first. Then let's talk about Chovy first. I mean, Chovy, whenever, especially when they're playing against some of these other top teams, right? Teams like Gen.G, it definitely seems to revolve around Chovy. Now, why is it that you don't have as much faith that that strategy, maybe it's not a planned strategy, but that can work against a team like Damwon?
I think Damwon, they have so many more things going for them that causes problems for DRX. Chovy is playing 1v2 in mid lane if Barrel's running around. The jungler gap is really big. There's a bit of a diffy in the top lane as well. And the bot lane meta is heavily skewed in Ghost's favor compared to Deft. So one of the other primary carries on the side of DRX is not in a very good position. And so for Chovy having to take on so much weight and so much of a burden in that series, with his top lane probably bleeding out, his jungler just getting gapped, I don't know really what DRX should expect to do. And then also Damwon or Showmaker is just basically the same tier of mid laner as Chovy.
Right. It's not like Chovy has a big advantage in mid lane either to begin with, right? Then, speaking of the bot lane, and especially you brought up the point of Barrel. I mean, I've talked about Barrel and Curie on this show with other people as well, where it seems the consensus is Barrel has really found his role, right, of this roaming support, and he's making it work, whereas Curie is still hailed as a really good support player, perhaps one of the best ones, mechanically speaking, just as a solo support player. In this matchup, does that give Barrel the edge just because of how the game is currently being played?
I feel like even though Karia's pretty insane, I feel like still Barrel just has the upper hand because of the dynamics of the marksmen that are surrounding each other. I feel like it's going to be very hard for them to do anything. And with Canyon playing the champions that he does as well, I don't think that Pioshik has any special edges that maybe you can factor into bot lane.
This is going a little bit more into just champion analysis, but I'm now curious. Then would you say it's a valid thing to consider for DRX to try maybe banning just the marksman? Like if the other bans are kind of all going to be shared in terms of priority anyway?
Yeah, I feel like so this is one of those metas where it shouldn't be possible, but because of the ghost dynamic, I think it almost is possible where you can actually elect for a 3 marksman ban. Now, the problem is that the other marksmen that still exist, I actually mentioned this, I feel like I just had this conversation on stream last night, so it's a pretty big coincidence. But generally, sometimes there's metas where there's a limited amount of champions that are actually viable and regularly getting practiced. And it really only helps when these champions are never getting banned. And what I mean by that is they're basically always getting picked, but they're not ban-worthy. So they almost appear in every single game. And when you throw a curveball out to certain teams and you just ban those 3 champions that are always getting picked, the enemy player might just be like, well, wait a minute. This is all I played in scrims for, 3-4 weeks. So it can throw a curveball. So I feel like if Caitlyn gets banned away by Damwon, and then you elect to go for Senna, Ezreal, Ashe, or something as a ban, you could try to throw a curve there, but I mean, Ziggs is still open. Syndra bottom lane isn't as viable, but that's the problem, is that there's still options. So I don't feel like it's as cut and dry.
Gotcha. Okay. But, humoring the idea is definitely a possibility, kind of thinking in that realm. And let's say they were able to do that. Let's say they catch Ghost off guard and they're able to kind of give Deft all the energy they need in the bot lane. Would that change your opinion in terms of the dynamic between those two teams? I know this is a lot of projection, but if the matches started heading that direction, does that even things up enough for DRX? I guess is my question.
I don't think so, because the top and jungle difference is way bigger than the current marksman meta difference.
Gotcha.
So I feel like Ghost is still going to be serviceable inside of the games, but I don't feel like Doran and Pioshik are going to put as much weight into the game as Nuguri and Canyon.
Right. Yeah. And this is a question that's been on a lot of people's minds, right? Damwon, like throughout their performance so far, just not even just the summer split, but it's always been the question of, okay, like sometimes it's this team has potential, sometimes it's, oh, like Nuggery's doing really well individually, sometimes it's Showmaker. But then this summer split, I mean, now looking back at the whole summer, what made this change? I mean, they seem unstoppable. Is it just their pure individual prowess, or do you see certain decisions and movements that are kind of unique to Damwon within the LCK?
I feel like the jungle meta got expanded a lot more. There's a lot more viable jungle picks right now. I feel like the top lane meta pool also got a little bit different, and I think that it's favoring Nuggery. They do seem to be acting a lot better now cohesively, but remember that there was the change, right, between Ghost and Nuclear. So Beryl no longer has, radiation poisoning, is basically what we could say, is he's free to now just run around the map, and he's shackled no longer. So these are really, really big team identity things that if you remove Ghost from the equation, things probably get very different. If you remove Beryl from the equation, when he's playing like this, things get very different. And I think that those are the biggest changes for them coming into summer, as well as the meta just being... It's so good. I don't think the meta has ever been so good for an LCK team as it is for Damwon right now.
Yeah, I think Damwon, if for anyone who's interested, right, in watching League of Legends, trying to analyze, and especially from a team aspect, Damwon is such a fun case to study, like you said, because there's so much going on, both within the game that favors them and also just within themselves. Like you said, the bot lane switch and some of these just tendency shifts that some of the players seem to have. And so that brings them to this finals, and you mentioned it earlier, but I assume so your prediction is that Damwon should be able to take this pretty handily?
Yeah, I predict 3-0 for Damwon in record fashion.
Oh, wow. Okay. All right. Okay. I mean, listen, anyone who's watched LCK for the summer, like, I think has to agree, if we're just going off of what we see so far, right? And you can't predict really anything else. Damwon, everything on paper says that they should be able to win, and win very, very quickly, like you said. So that is coming up this week. Of course, that will end the summer split, but that's not it for Korean League of Legends before we go to Worlds. And now we have the regional qualifiers, the Gauntlet. So could you give the fans a quick primer again for anyone who's not familiar on how this works?
So the Gauntlet is basically the last chance to qualify for Worlds, where a series of the remaining Korean teams that have enough points, other than the other Korean teams who have already qualified through Worlds, either by winning the summer split or by having the eligible amount of points to just auto-qualify, this is their last chance to play against T1 and get eliminated so that T1 goes to Worlds.
Right, of course, because that's just how it works. Of course, T1 is currently waiting in that regional qualifier, like you said.
Last time I checked the script, I mean, that's what was there.
I wasn't expecting that. For anyone really confused, the format is similar, right, to the playoffs, right? The winner moves on to the next match, and then they play T1, and then T1 moves on, and they keep winning until they go to Worlds. But one thing that's interesting is KT will be starting off as well in that gauntlet, right? In that first match, it's KT versus Africa, and obviously we're not seeing KT during the playoffs, so there's a little bit of a gap. Do you think KT can bring anything to, at least beat Africa and have a chance against T1?
I feel like KT could be the dark horse in the regional qualifier. I think aiming is phenomenal. I can't remember who I actually gave the All-Pro 80 carry vote to, but aiming was up there on my list really high, and he's very, very scary. So I think that KT, if they really hit their groove in the regional tournament, then yes, they could knock out Africa and then, proceed through some of the rounds. But I don't think they have what it takes to win it.
And of course, like you said, I mean, they have so much to go through for them to make this miracle run, right? From the first round of that gauntlet, the regional qualifiers, all the way to the end and make it to Worlds, especially against these Titans, right? I mean, T1, sure, like you said, they seem to have this weird off game in that game 3, but from what we saw at the end of summer, things started looking better for T1 once again. Like you said, when push comes to shove, T1 has always shown up. Then they'll have to go through two of these other teams, or one of these other teams that are remaining between Gen.G, DRX, and Damwon. For fans who aren't aware, when we're recording this before the finals happen, we don't know yet which one of those teams will move down to the regional qualifier because of how the points and the finalist work. So we'll have to kind of see the result. Still some variance, but yeah, any one of those teams, very, very scary. Aside from the T1 script, the T1 buff that they always have, I mean, do you think things change depending on who moves down from the top 3 teams here for the regional qualifier?
I think yes. I think things definitely do change depending on who moves down. I feel like if DRX, I think T1. Well, I mean, they should have been favored against Afrika, but who could have predicted that game 3? I feel like T1's favored against Afrika, favored against DRX. I think the only team they're not really favored against is probably Gen.G. And that one, I feel like it's close, but T1's going to win regionals, so it's fine. Yeah.
All right. So we don't really have to spend too much time thinking about all these hypothetical, fantasy situations. Okay. Well, that brings us to a close. I mean, that would bring us the potential of, Damwon, but 2 of Damwon, DRX, Gen.G, and then potentially T1 as that third team from the LCK. What does that outlook look like at Worlds, given a lot of these teams from the other regions starting to show their full strength?
Yeah, I feel like this Worlds, all the regions, things are really weird. I feel like NA looks weaker, the teams that they're sending this year at Worlds. I feel like Europe is looking weaker, and I feel like Korea only has one powerhouse team that is attending, which is Damwon. So that's what unfortunate. So this is going to be really interesting. Now, I did see that apparently the VCS teams are not able to attend Worlds. And I saw that there's lots of tweets calling for NA's 4th seed and Korea's 4th seed to fill the slots. And so that would be pretty interesting if that would end up happening, because that creates obviously a much different dynamic for all the Korean teams and whatnot. And then Cloud9, I believe, makes Worlds, right? If Riot would decide to go that route.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
So that would change things a bit. But does any of that matter against the top teams of LPL from what you've seen of the end of their split?
LPL's really interesting. I feel like TS is just an entire tier. So when I said this on Twitter, what I basically meant is that there's a noticeable gap within the same letter grade. You know how there's like S+, S, and S-. I feel like there's a noticeable gap between TS and the other teams in China.
Gotcha.
But I feel like with the help of Boris and a little bit of draft aid, they could maybe get upset, or they could lose. And Boris has total control of China. So
yeah, I mean, he's got the market on hold right there. I mean, it's all in his grasp. I know you love to see it. Boris just making bank over there in LPL. But overall, just from pure play, TES kind of seems to be just this grade above, and anything otherwise would be an upset from any of the regions, is what I'm hearing.
Yep.
I think, I mean, there's still a lot to look forward to, and I think the last question I have for you is, looking back, I mean, LCK, right? Spring started, LCK was trying to regroup, and then obviously during MCS, LPL just came in and put LCK back in place. LCK seemed to grow again in the summer. Looking at the whole year, are you kind of happy as a viewer and an analyst on LCK's progression so far this year?
So LCK's, there's a lot of things in LCK that make me really sad, and I'll be honest, it makes me angry. I talked about this in another content piece that's going to come out elsewhere at some point with one of the Korean community figures, where I'm upset that very repeatable, glaringly obvious, pretty fixable mistakes keep happening, whether it be in draft or losing to Boris or things of that nature, right? Trading Baron for Soul Point in a lot of instances, just really obvious macro blunders, random Rift Herald rotations. Things like this make me very depressed, because there's an absence of intent to change. And when there's an absence of intent, you're just waiting around for basically the next year to start and hope that things are different or players get shuffled and maybe the cohesion with them ends up changing things. But I think that in LCK, if I'm being completely honest, this has been one of the most depressing years from an analytical standpoint.
Just because of the points you mentioned so far?
I feel like it's pretty insane. Yeah. I feel like some of these things are really inexcusable. And I meme during my co-streams. I'm very vocal on Twitter. I mean, I bring it up during the cast and stuff. Losing to Boris and like other things that are so prevalent shouldn't be happening to the extent that they are in LCK, as well as in China. That's definitely its own thing. So it just feels like we're going through the motions in LCK.
Okay. From someone who's really kind of following it from a different angle, right? Following the scene.
Yeah.
To be honest, I felt pretty good about Summer so far, right? Things seem to look better, but do you think that's just the Damwon effect then, that they've just been showing such better play and better choices?
Yeah, I feel like it's probably the Damwon effect, because I know that a lot of professional players watching the DRX Gen.G series, it feels just very, very random. How do some of those games happen the way that they do? How do the losses happen the way that they do? What is the decision making when it's so crucial? With so much on the line, there's not some extra voice just basically saying, you know what, actually, I think we shouldn't do this. Or maybe we shouldn't opt into this kind of variance things. So I think that's a bit of a letdown. But yeah, I think a lot of people are riding the Damwon high right now. What's going to be really scary is come finals, DRX like wins 3-0. I mean, then...
yeah.
NA might beat us in groups,
I mean, I talked about that as well, like you mentioned on Twitter. I just said, like, it's going to be so scary for LCK fans if suddenly Damwon chokes right in the finals. And it's like, okay, the one hope we had that we could kind of latch onto and say, this is who we're trying to send to the finals of Worlds, now is also inconsistent. And who do you look to at that point, right? Now you just kind of have to hope for a miracle, which isn't a place that LCK is used to being or wants to be in, right? So... you kind of have to, I think if you're an LCK fan, you have to hope for Damwon either winning 3-0 or DRX putting up a really, really good show and one of the teams winning 3-2, I guess, is another one we can hope for. But I think something just to clarify for some of the fans, when you mentioned, kind of these things that are disappointing from LCK, you're talking about, like you said, these habits, the habitual mistakes, not necessarily, it's not that there isn't the potential or the player skill and things like that, right?
Yeah, no, the player, I still stand by the notion that the players are the best in the world. The Korean players individually and what they can do are the best. How they interact cohesively, how they build, and how they go about different things, not so much. All right, Morello, Roshan, Karthus. My window's looking real good. Some things to work on, but I think that's one thing that a lot of LCK fans can kind of find some relief in, right? It's not that the foundation has changed. It's just perhaps a bit of a different outlook now. And I think that's something that's, maybe been a long time coming for LCK, right? Even when LCK was winning, it kind of felt like it was more just habitually. And then now it's been a little bit since LCK hasn't been entirely at the top. So time to really shift things up. So, all right, well, finals, Damwon versus DRX, like you said. All things considered, Damwon should be winning at 3-0. And then at Worlds, we'll have to see. But maybe TS, or maybe because of what you mentioned, LS, I mean, Boris might just throw upsets in every match. We need Boris right now. So I think it's time I quiet down.
Boris.
We need Boris to help,
All right.
Boris is actually an inside job.
For a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay, let him do his thing. All right, let him go to Worlds. Yeah, sell his items and kind of help us out in the LCK, and then we'll talk about it for 2021, right? And then we'll talk about LCK changing things up for 2021. All right, well, we're in the last stretch here for the LCK, so don't forget to catch the finals on Saturday. LS will be commentating, of course, and then we'll get the regional qualifiers just a few days after, Monday through Wednesday next week. Still quite a few days of LCK left, so tune in, all you LCK fans. Catch LS on the commentary desk, and of course, for more content like this, subscribe right here on T1 Fighting. If you enjoyed this episode, give us a like, and let us know down in the comments below your scoreline predictions for Damwon Gaming versus DRX here at the LCK Finals. With that, have a legendary week.
TSM.
Never miss a beat.